Hello, testing, one, two, three. Hello, both of you, and Charlie. Welcome back. Beginner chess. How are we doing? Doing okay? I mean, I've already asked you all of this. Apart from the cold, yes. Um, I've already mentioned this before, but we're talking about how to use your pawns. So we're stopping because we already did what 6 lessons so far on openings, middle games. Hello. So we did opening, middle game, end game. Hello. So now we're like kind of switching tracks a little bit. We're talking about specific stuff nowadays. So we're talking about how to use our pawns. I've got some learning objectives again, as I always do. You can read through those if you want, but we'll get on to like, the main content. Just to recap, these are our pawns. They are essentially like the least valuable pieces, pretty much, because they don't move as much as all the other pieces do. And we begin with the game with 8 of them, so they're all either on the 2nd rank or the 7th rank. And white pawns, they move towards the 8th rank, and black pawns move towards the 1st rank, right? And they can only move forwards, they can't move backwards, and they only capture diagonally. And they can't move if there's another piece in front of it. This is all like the slides from the very first lesson that we did, just a recap of everything. So they move forwards twice on the very first time they move, and then after that, if they've moved once, they can't move twice again. They move 1 square forwards. Remember that pawns capture diagonally, so if there's a pawn, if there's a piece over here, it can't like shunt it and capture it. It can only capture diagonally. And remember that if a pawn reaches the end of the board, it can promote to anything it wants. So it could promote to a knight, a rook, a bishop, or a queen. And ideally, you want to pick a queen because the queen's the most valuable piece. But there's often like positions where you can promote to a knight or a bishop, and it's probably better than promoting to a queen. But like 98% of the time, it's best to like promote to a queen because it's the most powerful piece. So that's all the basics done. Like I already covered this in like the very first lesson, so this is like fresh as week. But today we're focusing on specifically how we can use the pawns pretty much. Because we have 8 of them, it's kind of strange. It's kind of like difficult to know what to do with them because obviously there's 8 of them and it'll be kind of hectic, I guess. Pawns are basically the structure of your chess position. Essentially what this means is that the way that you use your pawns like tells you what you have to do in the game pretty much. That's kind of a bit confusing, but like a simpler way of explaining this is that pawns are your fence pretty much. I mentioned last week that you're like an army general when you're playing chess, and pawns are like your front soldiers, right? They cover the front lines and like they protect all the pieces behind it and like you advance your pawns first and then your soldiers with it. Do you guys like know like the Roman shields? Like the red ones, like they all like have like, this formation that they do, and like they have all the horses behind it and they have the soldiers in front of it. It's kind of like that. I thought that was like a really nice way of putting it. Hello. And basically every single position that you have, if it has a pawn on the board, you have some kind of pawn structure. How you doing, man? And essentially, pawns determine how the game goes, right? And we'll get into this in a bit more detail later on, but that's essentially what I want to talk to you guys about today. Pawns are, even though I said that pawns were the least important, it's how you use them is how it's important pretty much. And remember that if pawns reach the end of the boards, they can promote to anything they want. So they have potential, right? Pawns together strong, right? Apes together strong, pawns together strong. It's kind of like that. And I talked about this last week. We talked about how to make all of our pieces happier. And we talked about like that we're kind of like an army general, right? And we need to figure out how we can make all of our pieces happier. And we looked at all the different pieces, but today, because we're looking at the pawns are happiest when they're together, right? When they're joined together diagonally. Because basically, remember, pawns capture diagonally. So if a pawn are like joined together diagonally, like this diagram, for example, then they're really strong, right? Because they support each other. Whereas if a pawn doesn't have any neighbors or any like pawns next to it, so let's take these 3 pawns, for example, right? They have no other pawns next to it, right? There's no pawn here. Obviously, you can't have a pawn here. Look at this middle one as well. There's no pawns supporting it on either side. That means that they're not feeling great. They're not very happy, right? And what this means is that they're weak, because if a pawn's like stuck on its own, it becomes a liability for you, right? And your opponent can take advantage of this, and they can sort of like focus their attack on those weak pawns, right? And they break apart the position. I played a tournament like 2 weeks ago. I think I was telling you guys about this before. But essentially, I was playing this one guy who's like 1,700 rating. That's like 400 points above me, right? And this guy was insane. And like I was doing a pretty good job against him, to be honest. Like I was holding my ground. But there was this one pawn that I had right in the center, and it wasn't like, it didn't have any neighbors or anything. So it was kind of like this one, and it didn't have any neighbors to support it. And all I tried to do throughout the entire game was try to make sure that I could get like some support for that pawn, because it's a weakness, right? So I tried to support it and everything, but whatever I could do, the guy was, 300, 400 points stronger than me. He put so much pressure on that pawn, and eventually he took the pawn, and that eventually resulted in me losing the game. Even though I was doing so well, it was one pawn that won the game for him, right? And so that's why I'm saying like pawns are so important, right? How you use the pawns is the difference between a 1,300 like me and a 1,700 like the guy that I played, right? Even though we were competing like pretty well together, he still won because of that one pawn. So it's important to make sure that all your pawns have pawn neighbors, right? Even though you can support it with pieces, so you can bring your queen, your rook behind it, it's always important to make sure that pawns have neighbors, right? Pawn neighbors. And another concept that we kind of mentioned last week as well, but we're going into more detail this week, is the concept of doubled pawns, right? Essentially, double pawns, remember that pawns capture diagonally, right? So if a pawn captures diagonally, it has a chance of going onto another file, right? So for example, this two pawns over here, they're doubled pawns because they're on the same C file, right? There's like sort of sitting on each other's faces pretty much. And that's not good, because this pawn becomes pretty weak, right? Because remember that pawns can't move forward if there's another pawn or piece in front of it. So this pawn over here, the one that I've highlighted, has nowhere to go. So it's kind of weak. It can't really do anything. It can't march forward down the board because there's this pawn in front of it. And again, like I said before, that once a pawn is weak, like if a pawn is weak, then that means it becomes a liability in your position, right? Your opponent, they can like focus their attack on it, and essentially your position might crumble, right? We mentioned before, like pawns are kind of like your fence, like your shield pretty much. And any weakness in your fence or shield, that means like your entire structure becomes like pretty bad, right? So try to make sure that you don't have double pawns. But there are examples where double pawns are good. So remember we talked about last week how to make all of our pieces happier. And we talked about the rook, right? The rook is happiest when there's open files, for example, right? And double pawns, there can be examples where if you make double pawns, it opens up another open file, right? So in this position, we have this D file over here that's basically open because we took and we made these double pawns, right? So if we placed a rook on this D file, for example, it's really happy there, right? Because it's an open file now. So even though I said don't like make double pawns, there are examples where you have to do that because it makes everything else happy, right? So anything in chess, like any move that you make in chess, has multiple effects, right? So if I take this pawn over here and make double pawns, it becomes a weakness, but it also has another effect of opening up the file and ensuring that your rooks get into the game and they make it happier, right? So as I've said over here, don't rule out a pawn capture just because it creates double pawns, right? Because there's so many different things that like a pawn capture does, right? Even though it makes double pawns, it still opens up lines for your rooks and it makes other things happier as well. So even though I said don't make double pawns, there'll still be examples where you can. And I've got a couple of examples. I want you guys to like sort of figure out which pawns are stronger, like which side is stronger. So is black stronger or is white stronger? And you gotta like try and figure out which side is stronger, like based on their pawn structure. So this first example, who do you guys think is stronger? Do you think white is stronger, or do you think black is stronger? What do you guys think? Black? How come? Okay. So you're saying that black's stronger because they have like these different pawn chains over here. Okay. Any other reasons? Yeah. Okay. Exactly. So this pawn, it doesn't have neighbors, right? We talked about neighbors. And there's no neighbors because it doesn't have any pawns on the c file or the e file next to it. So it becomes a liability for white. And you can, this is like basically like the same position that I had in that tournament game that I was talking about. This pawn was in the center, it didn't have any neighbors, and the opponent put so much pressure on it, even though I tried to defend it. And that was all because it didn't have any neighbors, right? We've got another example. Who do you think is stronger, white or black? White? How come? Mhm. Uh-huh. Yeah, pretty much. So, like you're saying, this pawn chain over here, it's connect 4, right? It's 4 in a row. So this pawn chain is very strong and kind of like a small pawn chain over here. Even though black has 2 pawn chains here as well, this one pawn in the center, it doesn't have any neighbors again. And black also has double pawns here as well. So this pawn over here can't move, so it becomes a liability for black. So I was looking for, the 2 answers I was looking for was this pawn was kind of weak because it has no neighbors, and this pawn over here is doubled. So, I mean, you got that like immediately, so well done. Got another example over here. Who do you think is better, white or black? White. How come? Yep. Uh, it's all about the neighbors, pretty much. So even if it is like this, pretty much, there's still potential for it to have neighbors, right? As in like diagonal neighbors. So like this pawn can push forwards, and it becomes a pawn chain, right? So it's still really good. But because this pawn over here is kind of on its own, it doesn't have any neighbors right now. That's why it's better for white, because this pawn, even though you can push this forwards, I guess, is still it's still a weakness right now, because you have to it's still kind of in the center pretty much, and you need to, if you were playing as white, you'd have to target this pawn, and it becomes a weakness for black. Even though they do have a pretty solid pawn chain over here, white also has kind of like a similar pawn chain over here. They have the thing that I was looking for is that this pawn is in the middle, right? It doesn't have any neighbors right now. So even though it might have neighbors later in the future, so if you push this pawn over here, creating the pawn chain, right now it doesn't. So right now white is better, I'd say. I'd prefer to play as white in this position. Got another one. Who do you think is better, white or black? You've already answered 3, so I'll leave it to someone else to answer this. Who do you guys think is better? Black? Okay. So this is kind of a similar one to the other one as well. So actually, I won't explain it. What did you use? Which one did you say was better, white or black?
black because it might have a little more control over the center.
Okay, yeah.
But then it has those two, well, they have neighbors, but they're kind of not doing anything
Mm-hmm.
how they make pawns.
Okay, fair enough. So I'd say that it's kind of equal-ish. Like there's no, it's kind of difficult because, as you can see, like as you said, black has these two pawns in the center, right? They've got the diagonal chain. So their grasp on the center is a lot better. But however, for white, there is this pawn over here. So like I said before, it's kind of similar to the previous one. Even though it doesn't have neighbors right now, it will have neighbors. So if I push this B pawn over here, it creates that chain. But the main thing that I was looking for was that this pawn over here doesn't have neighbors at all, right? So, like, if I'd say black is kind of stronger, just a little bit stronger because of this one pawn here. And I think I've got another one. Yes, I've got two more. So, who do you guys think is winning? Or not winning, but who do you guys think is better? And it's black to move because, as you might be able to see, there's a trade, a potential trade. Who is better? Any ideas? You would say black? Mm-hmm. So I put black to move because it's kind of important to think later on as well. So not just specifically this position, but what might happen later on as well. So as you can see, that these two pawns are staring at each other, right? So if it's black to move, then the only pawn that can move right now is this pawn. So it has two options, right? It can either push forward and nothing really happens, or you can trade it with this pawn and white recaptures like this, right? So out of those two positions, either pushing it or taking results in kind of different positions, because if we push this, for example, even though we do have this structure over here, this like the diagonal pawns over here, it's kind of difficult to play on with black because there's not really much else you can do after that. Obviously, you can push these pawns as well and create like the diagonal structure again, but it's kind of equal at that point because no one can really push forwards, I guess. This is kind of difficult. I shouldn't really included this in a beginner lesson, but it's nice to like look at intermediate stuff as well. But I'd say it's kind of equal if it's black to move. If it's white to move, however, that becomes a different question. Why do you guys think that it's a different question? Yeah. So because it's white to move, the only thing that white can do is capture this pawn, right? There's no pushing like we talked about before, right? This pawn can't push forwards because there's another pawn in the way. So essentially this is just a free pawn, right? Because if it's white to move, they can take this pawn and there's nothing that black can do to recapture it right now. So white is better. The reason why it might not be better for white, because we talked about doubled pawns, right? So if I take this, we get two pawns on the C file, right? We have the white pawn here and we have the white pawn here on the same file. So technically it does become like a weakness for white because, as I said before, double pawns are sort of like a liability. But the reason why it's kind of better is A, because you've taken a free pawn, right? Even though you've created double pawns, you've taken a free pawn. So that's pretty good because you're a pawn up, right? And the other thing is that even though it does become like a weakness right now, so if I take this pawn, it's kind of double pawns, I can reinforce it with like a move b4, for example, right? And we get this like a C, right? Because there's a pawn here, and a pawn here. So they're all supporting each other diagonally, even though they're on the same file. So, like I said before, like, don't dismiss a move just because it creates double pawns. Like, see how you can use it to your advantage, pretty much. And in this position, you can use it to your advantage. And it becomes better for white, because A, again, like I said, A, it creates, like, you capture a free pawn, and B, because you can support that pawn, and it's not really a weakness. So, to summarize, white is better in this position. I want to move on from that, because I told you guys before that pawns are basically your structure, right? But like I said before, the Roman army, right, for example, the shields and everything, you can't just like sit back and let your opponent do stuff to you. You got to take the initiative in some positions, right? And you got to march your pawns forwards. And the reason why I'm telling you this is because even though you do have to march forwards for your attacks, sometimes enthusiastic beginners, you tend to like overextend your pawns. And what this means is like you push it too far that it becomes a weakness, right? And I've got an example for you over here. So this position over here. You might think of this and be like, oh, I can push all of these pawns over here, right? I can make them really strong, I can connect them diagonally, and I can attack this enemy king because the rook's over here, and it's sort of on its own, right? And the reason why I say this is that it's kind of an overextension of those pawns, is because even though you are going for an attack, it's creating a weakness for your king. So remember I told you guys in last week's lesson, I watched too much YouTube, I'm sorry. Last week's lesson, I told you guys that the king is happiest when it's surrounded by its enemy, when it's surrounded by its like pieces and pawns, right? So right now the king is like extremely happy. It's got a rook next to it, it's got 3 pawns next to it. So starting to push all of these pawns means that the king is pretty weak. So that's why I've said that there's no way back, right? So pawns can't move backwards. So even if you think that you've extended it too far, so you've overextended it, you can't push it back, like you can't move them backwards. It creates like an irreversible change to your position. So always think twice when you're moving a pawn. Ask yourself if you're creating a weakness, pretty much. So, like I said before, if you're thinking of pushing these pawns, think about what else it does to your pieces and to your enemy pieces as well. So even if you think that, oh, you're going for an attack on your enemy's king, it's doing damage to your own king as well. So it's a risk-reward situation, kind of. It's your choice if you want to push the pawns, but I think if you're stopping your king from having safety, then I wouldn't recommend it, to be honest. So how do we actually break down this fence, right? This shields, this Roman shield. And we do this through pawn breaks, right? So pawn breaks are sort of like small little chip-aways, like we have to chip away at the enemy fence, the enemy shields, right? We have to sort of like break it one block at a time. And we do this with our own pawns. So if we have like moves that damage the integrity of your opponent's pawn chains, then we should do that. And I've got 3 examples of pawn breaks in the same position over here. All of them are completely bad, right? I'll show you like examples of good ones later on. But all of these are pretty bad because, let's start with this one, for example. If we push this pawn, it is a pawn break because you're pushing the pawn forward to try and damage the integrity of the position, but it does a terrible job, right? Because pushing this pawn forward means that it can be captured twice, and it's not great, right? Technically, it's not really a pawn break, but it is a pawn break because... Anyway, yeah. The 2 main pawn breaks, I'd say, are these 2 pawns, so the one on pawn f7 and b7, because... Let's take this one, for example, the one on b7. If we push this pawn forwards, then that means that we challenge the integrity of this pawn structure, right? We're saying to this pawn, do you want to capture or not, right? What do you want to do, pretty much? And it's asking this pawn, do we push or do we capture? Capturing means that this pawn chain becomes smaller, right? As I said before, we're trying to damage the integrity of this pawn structure. So getting rid of this pawn means that it's weaker, right? So even if we push as well, it becomes these two pawns like don't have the support of this one, and so pushing this or taking it, regardless, it sort of damages the integrity of the position. Same as this one as well, because look at this pawn chain over here. We're saying to this pawn, go away, pretty much. We're telling this pawn to go away. And again, I said before, like, they're not great pawn breaks because at the end of the day, they do more damage to our position than to the enemy position. So it does more damage to black than it does to white. And I say this because if we push this pawn, notice that we have two pawns here, right? So if we trade off this pawn, there's only one pawn remaining here. And so remember I told you that pawns, they need to like go together, right? They need to support each other diagonally. So trading this off means that this pawn is on its own, right? And it'll be pretty sad. And kind of similar with this one as well, because again, like if you trade this off, this pawn goes over here, and right now it doesn't have any neighbors, right? So it feels pretty bad. So pretty much pawn breaks, they're ways of trying to challenge the integrity of the position. I've got a couple examples, and I want you guys to tell me if this pawn break is a good move or not. So pawn on f6 to pawn on f7 to f6. This is difficult. This is kind of like borderline intermediate stuff as well. But I wanted to teach you guys this because eventually, like, you're gonna have to learn it one day. So I figured it might be today, you know. But what do you guys think? I appreciate that it is difficult. So do take your time. Sorry? What? It's a good idea. Okay. What does everyone else think? Yes. Pretty good idea. You're saying it's not a good idea. You should. Okay. So it does take it, and you're actually correct. Like, it is a bad idea for white, but it's a good idea for black. So the reason why this is good for black is because if we push this pawn, we're sort of challenging the integrity of these pawns, right? So if we push it, white takes, and black can take either way, so they can take with the e pawn or the g pawn, and we remain with these, like, we remain with 3 pawns left on the board if we're playing as black. But as white, this pawn, like, remains over here, and right now it doesn't have an e neighbor anymore, and kind of it doesn't have a neighbor as well on the c file, but pretty much we've broken apart this structure in the middle, whereas we still have, if we're playing as black, we still have this structure with black. So it's a good idea for black. It's not such a good idea for white to capture it, I'd say. Does that make sense? Like, I appreciate that this is difficult stuff. So
if you were white and had black on the board, you would just pass it. Is that what you would do?
I wouldn't pass it, actually. Pretty much, remember that we want neighbors for our pawns. So black's saying to this pawn, what do you want to do? Like, it's saying to go away. So I would reinforce it, actually. I'd reinforce it with another neighbor. So I'd push this pawn forward, so that even if black does take, I can recapture this way. And so I still keep this chain, right? I still keep the chain in the center of the board. And black doesn't really do much to our position, right? And at the end of the day, like, even if I do push this pawn forward, the capture, recapture, it's actually better for white, because remember, this file has opened. I remember rooks are happier on open files, so immediately I'm thinking, bring the rook to the f file, and I've made my rook even happier. So everything, like, has an impact on everything else. So this one pawn move has an impact on the rook that was in that corner as well. So chess is so fascinating like that as well. So it's good for black to challenge that right now, but white can do better. Like, they can reinforce it. I don't expect you guys to, like, find that as well. Like, again, this is pretty, like, intermediate stuff as well. So it's good that, like, you're asking these questions as well. Like, what would white do? You know? Because eventually you are going to face these kind of positions as well. So it's good to ask those kind of questions. I've got another one in the same position. What do you guys think? Is it good for black to push that pawn? No? You're shaking your head. How come? Yeah.
But I'm not sure it's good in that. You have two common.
So that's exactly what I wanted to tell. Like that's exactly what I wanted to talk about in this position. So pretty much, it's kind of like a double-edged sword, pretty much, for pushing this pawn, because if white captures, then it's a loss of a pawn for black, right? So they've basically said, have this pawn for free, take it. But the reason why they do that is because, like we said before, like you said, is that you have these doubled pawns over here, right? You have this pawn on c2, and you have this double pawn on c5 as well. So, again, like that becomes a weakness. And another thing is that once you break apart this chain, this pawn doesn't have any neighbors anymore, right? So you have these two pawns over here. They're not doing much, like they don't have any neighbors or anything. So it becomes a weakness for white and it becomes great for black. So that's one of the main reasons why black will decide to play that pawn move. Even though it loses them a pawn, it creates future potential for them to like, it creates a weakness in white's position and black can take advantage of that pretty much. So again, kind of a double-edged sword. Even though it's a double pawn, it's still a loss of a pawn for black. Does that make sense, by the way? Yeah?
Could you also again move the pawn to c3?
Again, precisely. So if you remember back to my London lesson, so the opening 2 lesson, no? We talked about c5, c3. So this is exactly what it is, right? If they play c5, you reinforce the pawn chain in the center, c5, c3. It's good that you remember that, well done. I've got another example for white this time. Is it good to play the move c5? What do you guys think? Yeah? What does everyone else think? It's good to play c5? You think so? Okay. How come?
Pawn moves c5. If the d6 pawn captures, you just take the d4 pawn to
Mhm.
capture that.
Yeah. So, exactly. So, I think it is good for white as well, because look at this pawn chain, right? The connect 4 pawn chain. And we're essentially saying to this pawn chain, what are you going to do? Like, I'm challenging the integrity of this pawn chain. How are you going to defend it, right? And pushing this pawn forwards means that if black captures, like over here, then white recaptures. And like you said, it has potential to go forwards again and create this connect 5, if you like, right? And if this pawn moves, if this pawn captures over here, so for black, you have these two pawns over here, and it's no longer a connect 4, it's a connect 2, right? So it's not great for black, but it's like really good for white. And that's it, pretty much. I thought there was something else that I needed to mention, but I don't remember. We'll move on to the next one, but first, does that make sense so far? Like if I push this pawn, this breaks apart this connect 4, it becomes a connect 2, pretty much. Does that make sense? Yeah? This one is the final one. This is a bit more difficult because we've added all the pieces to it as well. What do you guys think? Is pushing that pawn forwards a good idea for white, or is it a bad idea? You don't know? Okay.
See a potential strategy.
Okay.
If you do that and their g7 pawn captures that,
Yep.
you capture that with your g pawn, then your rook can like move to that whole file.
Yeah. So I'll give you a devil's advocate over here. So you've said that if we do push this pawn, black can capture it and we can capture back to get the rook over here. Black doesn't have to capture. So if we push this pawn, black doesn't have to capture it. What might black do instead? So the entire point of this is to refute the structure over here. So the king safety, right? G6, exactly. So this move is actually terrible for white because if we push this pawn forwards, black can push the pawn forward as well. They don't have to take, right? Just because there's you're able to take it doesn't mean you have to take it, right? Black can push this pawn forwards. And essentially what that does is that helps black, right? So now that the pawn is here, you've sort of created this diagonal structure again for black. So even though you've tried to challenge the integrity of the black structure, you've essentially helped them, right? And that's not a good thing, right? So this is not good for white. So this is pretty much to tell you that just because someone's attacking your pawn chain with a pawn break doesn't mean that you have to respond doesn't mean that you have to capture the pawn, right? There's always three options, right? You can either capture it, you can leave it as it is, or you can push. So this is an exercise of telling you push, pretty much. There's always another way. And that's pretty much all I have for today. It is your turn though, right? And essentially what I want you guys to do, it's a little bit different to what we do before, but today you're just going to have pawns on the board. No kings, no queens, no rooks, no bishops, just the pawns. And what your goal is to just play with the pawns and try to make sure that you can get one of your pawns, at least one of them, to the other side of the board. And as a defender, you're supposed to try and stop your enemy from getting their pawns to the other side of the board. And if you have any questions, just let me know. But yeah, other than that, thank you guys for coming as well. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoy this exercise. This is a really fun one. I really like this one.